differences right now that seem as big as black and white. CNN's Michelle Kaczynski in Moscow for us, monitoring these talks. Michelle, what are you learning?
Hi, John. You know this was always going to be an extremely difficult meeting. But what was unusual was to see that tension on full display even before it started. You know, before this meeting, they usually have a photo op. There are just pleasantries exchanged, or at least cordialities. But in this case, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, just launched right into it with his sharp criticism of U.S. strikes on Syria, saying that they're a violation of international law and can't happen again. He talked about the fact that there's not clarity even on the U.S. position on Syria. And he took that opportunity to slam the State Department for not having enough people. There are still so many of those high-level positions that are not filled. And he said that it's been difficult to communicate. Here's some of what he said.
Сегодня мы продвинемся по этому пути.
And it is important for us to understand your intentions of the U.S. and the real intentions of this administration. We hope that we can clear up today these things.
Добро пожаловать.
Welcome.
Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, for his part in this kind of pre-meeting display, stuck to the cordial. He talked about the relationship, that this is an opportunity to find cooperation as well as go over those differences. But you hear things coming from the Russian government, I mean, calling the U.S. rhetoric primitive and loutish. But President Trump had his own words this morning in an interview for Russia. Listen.
Frankly, Putin is backing a person that's truly an evil person. And I think it's very bad for Russia. I think it's very bad for mankind. It's very bad for this world. But when you drop gas or bombs or barrel bombs, they have these massive barrels with dynamite and they drop them right in the middle of a group of people. And in all fairness, you see the same kids, no arms, no legs, no face. This is an animal.
And what we've been hearing over the past couple of days from each side makes it very difficult to see what cooperation they can pull out of this. I mean, the U.S. and Russia do cooperate on a number of issues, but after this has happened over Syria, we're just going to have to wait and see what comes out of this press conference later. I think everybody's going to be watching that. Still remains to be seen whether President Putin will sit down with Tillerson. We've seen a couple of signs that this might happen, but you know, just a couple of years ago, it was Putin himself awarding Tillerson with the Order of Friendship here in Russia. What a different message he's sending out right now.
Absolutely, and it would break precedent if he does not meet with the U.S. Secretary of State, especially on his first trip.
Every Secretary of State since Cordell Hull. That's a long time.
That's your history fact for the morning. That is a long time. John Berman, thank you. Michelle Kaczynski, thank you. So joining us now to talk about all of this with our panel, retired Commander Kirk Lippold. He's former commander of the USS Cole. And Juliet Kayyem is here, our national security analyst and former Assistant Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. So, Juliet, let me begin with you. Worse, according to Putin, U.S. relations are than before. So much for a reset.
That's exactly right. I would say the stakes are higher for Secretary Tillerson than for the Russian team, only because he's new to this and he has to be able to show that not only is he an appropriate Secretary of State, but that there is something that we might call the Trump doctrine. You and Michelle just mentioned Syria and what Russia has been saying about our attack in Syria. But also remember just yesterday, Tillerson is said sort of casually, but in I would say a very harmful manner, what does it mean to the American taxpayer to defend the Ukraine? That is heard by the Russians as just another sign of a very confused policy. Are we going to stand behind Europe, or are we going to try to do a reset with Russia? So some clarity is, I think, demanded by Tillerson, by the Russians, but also by, I think, the Europeans at this stage.
You know, Commander Lippold, we should note these meetings are happening right now. We're just getting little drips about what they said before and have leaked out during. Let me read you one comment from the Secretary of State as he was walking in. He said he wanted to clarify areas of sharp difference so that we can better understand why these differences exist. areas of sharp difference. I'm not sure I understand what that means. The United States thinks that Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons against its own people. The Russians, including Vladimir Putin, say that that was staged. That's more than a little difference of opinion. How do you bridge a gap like that?
I think the way you grab it is you see, just like this morning, when the posturing's done, Lavrov meets him, won't even look Secretary Tillerson in the eye, and let's get down to business. Get the cameras out of the room, get the people out of the room, and let's talk. Okay, where do the differences lie? What do we see for how we're going to deal with the fact that you failed to get chemical weapons out of Syria, because clearly they used them? And oh, by the way, I think Secretary Tillerson would probably be wise to present the Russians with, here's the evidence, here's what we picked up with intelligence to be able to confirm with absolute certainty that they carried out this attack, where they carried it out from, and how it was conducted. Once they have that, okay, we clear the air. Let's lay down. What are our priorities and where do we have common ground? We still need to continue the fight with ISIS. We still need to clarify that we're not going to tolerate the use of chemical weapons. Now we need to figure out, is Bashar al-Assad going to stay? Is Russia going to continue to want to back him? And what are the consequences going to be for Russia if they continue to do that, if he continues with this brutal war against his own people?
Juliet, you pointed out something that Tillerson said that is confounding to many people when he said, why should the American taxpayer be interested in Ukraine? Why should they care about Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine? Why should they care about Crimea? It's confusing. But on top of that, you had Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican, calling out Tillerson and going as far as to call him naive. Listen to this.
When Secretary Tillerson says he hopes that Russia will realign itself with Western democracies and break away from Syria and Iran, with all due respect, I like Secretary Tillerson. That's pretty naive.
Do you agree? Is it naive?
Absolutely, it's not going to happen, and this is where Tillerson's remarks about the Ukraine are so sort of mind-boggling at this stage, because there are differences. They have to accept that, and Tillerson, by sort of thinking out loud, sort of raises the stakes both for Europe and Russia. There's no thinking out loud anymore. He is Secretary of the State. Pontificating about how do I sell this to the American public is not his job. He needs to make a bright line statement about our commitment to Europe and NATO, as well as a statement to Russia. I will say one other thing. With all of this going on, Syria, Europe, and the relationship between Russia and the United States, we have this other thing, right, which is, did Russia, or Russia's involvement with our election, which ought to be addressed by Tillerson at this stage to ensure that at least in future elections, Russia does not do what it did in this last one.
So, Commander, what about that? How closely is Russia watching the various election stories coming out of the United States, including the news today that Carter Page, there was a FISA warrant on him?
I think they're watching it, but quite frankly, they're going to be disinterested in it. They waged an information warfare campaign during the election, the degree to which we're still trying to determine if it had any true effect on whether or not it helped President Trump get elected or not. But at the end of the day, when you go back to the Middle East and look at it, I think Juliet's absolutely right. He is the Secretary of State right now. Secretary Tillerson, you can't think out loud. What happened in the Crimea and eastern Ukraine is critical, because the Europeans do look at that. They look at how the United States reacts to it, how we're going to engage in the future, and what that portends for NATO and all those countries. The Baltic countries especially are very concerned as NATO members. If we are attacked, can we expect NATO to be backing us? So we need strong statements, and you need something between what's thought up here and the filter that goes in before it comes out here from the Secretary of State.
Well, look, a lot of people watching these meetings going on right now between the Secretary of State and the Russian Foreign Minister. Again, we will keep our eye on them as well for when they come out. Commander Kirk Lippold, Juliet Kayyem, great to have you with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
We have a CNN exclusive this morning. Congressional insiders telling CNN that documents they have seen, they contradict claims made by the House Intelligence Committee Chair Devin Nunes. Both Democrats and Republicans tell CNN they've seen no evidence that the Obama administration did anything wrong. One source even says there's absolutely no smoking gun here.
So in an interview with the president taped before this new CNN exclusive reporting, we saw the president double down on his allegations that former National Security Advisor Susan Rice committed a crime. Listen.
She said she didn't do it for political reasons. Susan Rice told Andrea Mitchell.
Does anybody really believe that? Nobody believes that. Even the people that try to protect her in the news media. It's such a big story. and I'm sure it will continue forward. But what they did is horrible.
CNN Chief National Security Correspondent Jim Sciutto reporting that story, helping break this news. What have you learned?
Well, in short form, Republican and Democratic lawmakers, frankly, not backing up the president's claim. They're casting doubt on claims by Devin Nunes that the Obama administration officials improperly requested the names of U.S. individuals that had been redacted in intelligence documents. CNN sources say these lawmakers have now seen the very same intelligence documents that Nunes reviewed last month and then shared with the White House, although we then learned that the White House actually shared with him. They tell CNN they see no evidence that the Obama administration officials he mentioned did anything out of the ordinary or illegal. One congressional source described the requests as, quote, normal and appropriate for senior national security officials in these positions.
And I know that you and Armanu Raju have talked to multiple sources, people who have seen, held, read through these documents. What do they tell you about their concerns?
One source telling us that there is absolutely no smoking gun in these reports. In fact, this person in particular even urging the White House to declassify them to make it clear to the public that there's nothing alarming in them. A lot of questions have been raised. In particular, you heard the president mention there as well about Susan Rice, whether she acted illegally in requesting the names of Trump officials incidentally collected in intelligence reports. President Trump, as we've said, says he believes that she may have broken the law. But again, multiple sources and from both parties who've reviewed these documents say flatly they just don't back up the president's claims she may have broken the law. These are routine requests, and they're ones that might happen as senior intelligence officials are looking at these intelligence reports. They see an American citizen mentioned there, and to understand what's behind the reports, they might then ask the intelligence community for that American's identity so they could understand the gravity of those intelligence reports.
So what's that process, Jim? Lay out the process for actually unmasking the identity of someone in a report like this.
So this is how it works. These rules were set by the intelligence community. Certain national security officials can make some requests, a very limited number. The intelligence agencies, principally the NSA in this case, because it involves communication intercepts, they then decide whether to grant those requests. Now, to be fair, I'm told that in practice, the requests of the most senior officials are rarely denied. If a Susan Rice comes to the intelligence community, asks for an unmasking, they're really not going to tell her no. So some of the members of the House and Senate committees that we spoke with said that despite their judgment that they haven't seen anything untoward in the requests made, they do have legitimate questions about how these standards are set. Are they too loose? Should they be tightened up? Should it be harder for administration officials to request unmasking? They have those questions. Those remain legitimate questions.
So, Jim, another leg, another branch of this whole Russia story and saga is Carter Page, right? Someone who billed himself as a foreign policy advisor to the president while he was running, someone who the president has certainly distanced himself from. The Washington Post is reporting this morning the FBI obtained a FISA warrant for months to monitor his conversations. And that's pretty extraordinary because they would have to convince a judge there's probable cause that someone, would be Carter Page at this point, was working as an agent of a foreign power.
Listen, if confirmed by others, the Washington Post, certainly credible, it's a significant story because to this point, we've known that the FBI is investigating possible links between Russians and Trump officials. Now we know they took the step of issuing a warrant because they had probable cause. That's significant.
Jim Sciutto for us in Washington. I don't mean to cut you off, Jim, but I want to go to Washington right now and listen to Sean Spicer, the White House press secretary, speaking a day after his explosive claims about Adolf Hitler.
And I hope each person can understand that part of existing is understanding that when you do something wrong, if you own up to it, you do it. You let people know, and I did. So for me, I mean, obviously there's two takeaways. One is it's a very holy week for both the Jewish people and the Christian people, and this is not to make a gaffe and a mistake like this is inexcusable and reprehensible. And so of all weeks, this was not, this compounds that kind of mistake. But second of all, and so first of all, it's obviously it's it really is painful to myself to know that I did something like that, because that obviously was not my intention. And to know when you screw up that you possibly offended a lot of people, I just, and so I would ask obviously for folks' forgiveness to understand that I should not have tried to make a comparison. There's no comparing atrocities. And it is a very solemn time for so many folks that this is part of that. And so that's obviously a very difficult thing personally to deal with, because you know that a lot of people who don't know you wonder why you would do that. So that's first and foremost. And then secondly, just from a professional standpoint, it's obviously disappointing. I think the president had an unbelievable couple weeks. He took very decisive action in Syria. He's made tremendous progress with President Xi and his visit to China. And your job as the spokesperson is to help amplify the president's actions and accomplishments. And I think he's had an unbelievable, successful couple weeks. And when you're distracting from that message of accomplishment, and that's your job is to be the exact opposite. On a professional level, it's disappointing because I think I've let the president down. And so on both a personal level and a professional level, that would definitely go down as not a very good day in my history.
Did the president say anything to you last night?
I did not talk to him. No, I haven't talked to him this morning.
Any message through anyone else from the president?
I don't get into private conversations. I just, again, this was my mistake, my bad, that I needed to fix, and so I'm not going to get into any additional conversations that I may or may not have had. But I will just say that this was mine to own, mine to apologize for, and mine to ask for forgiveness for.
Turn to other issues. Do you think the press is fair to you or gunning for you?
I don't think it's monolithic. I think some folks clearly have an agenda. Some folks are open-minded, and some folks probably root for you. But there's sort of a spectrum.
What's the surprise in the job for you? I mean, you were over at the Republican headquarters for a number of years. What's the surprise in this job?
I don't know that there's a ton. I mean, I think the level of scrutiny is obviously. I wouldn't say it's a surprise, but it's sort of the magnitude to which it exists is fairly unbelievable. No matter what you do, what you wear, it kind of gets amplified to a degree that you couldn't imagine. And I also think what the priorities are about what gets covered, what doesn't get covered. I think and sort of the obsession with some of the process, which I always understand. I've been doing this for a long time. I understand process and I understand ups and downs, but I think when you look at the issues that our world and our country are dealing with, sometimes the obsession with, who's up and who's down in 1 week or who said what in a meeting versus the substance of what's being taken to improve the lives of the American people or protect us or to deal with world incidents is sort of intriguing.
Do you have a sense you work for the president, for the White House, or for the American people? Who do you think you're working for?
Well, to some degree, it's all. But
and how do you reconcile that? Because sometimes, you're in a position of advocating for.
Right. At the end of the day, the president won an election by that the American people voted in, and so. It is his, I ultimately answer to him. It is his agenda that is being pursued, as that's the case of anyone who's in elective office. That you are elected by a group of people, and you pursue an agenda that you feel that you communicated to those people or are accountable to those people, whether or not you brought it up during a campaign or not. So first and foremost, it is the president that my job is to go out there and. Help amplify and discuss what he's doing and why he's doing it and the accomplishments that he's having.
How much access do you have to the president?
Plenty. That's not a problem.
I mean, you talk to him every day, spend time with him every day?
Every day.
How does your day start?
I get up around 5:15. I start reading email and then usually try to do some kind of exercise. And then, again, we're kind of monitoring the news of the day, the issues of the day, going over what the events are. We have meetings early in the 7 o'clock hour. And then we basically are just trying to figure out what we're advancing. as well as what the incoming is, if you will. What are the issues that are playing hot? What are the issues that we think are going to overtake the day? What are the events that are happening, and how we're going to communicate those?
In terms of dealing with the media, I assume you get complaints from the media, right?
One or two.
All right. What are the complaints you get from the media?
There's always going to be an issue with access. They want more
access to you or access to the
everything.
president?
I mean, it doesn't matter what to the parking lot, to the front lawn, trees. I mean, there's nothing that they don't want access to. That's probably first and foremost what they want, and then obviously administration officials, the president, you name it.
And other complaints in the press?
I think there's been one or two.
All right. In terms of, I mean, I'm trying to sort of see, how to facilitate a better relationship between the press and the White House.
Look, I think it's naturally combative because no matter what the administration is or what the party is, the press is, always going to want more of what it is, and that's the nature of the relationship. But I think that there are some things that, to your question, I think the advent of social media, and I know Ari's talked about this a lot, Dana Perino's talked about this, the most recent Republican press secretaries that sort of were at the advent of this on the Republican side, that there is an element of being first and trying to get things into the ether on social media, et cetera, that has really changed the dynamic by which that room and the relationship exists.
One thing, I mean, people would much prefer not to have anonymous sources. Yeah. Much prefer. Yet when you...
Well, I think there's a difference, just so I'm clear. Like, there are people on a policy level, right, who are implementing, that are helping to shape policy. And because of the nature of what they do, they don't want their names out there, not because they're hiding, but because they're there to serve the people in the government, and it's not that they're hiding it. But I think when the press you can bring someone into a briefing room and say this briefing's on background, but everyone can see who they are. They're talking that's a much different thing than where we'll get a phone call and say, hey, we have 5 background sources that say that, you crossed the street the wrong way. And the question is, there's no accountability. We don't know who they are. Are they inside the White House? Are they outside the White House? Do they breathe? There's a lot of that is very difficult to respond to because you're shooting at almost a ghost. I think we try to minimize the use of and I wouldn't say anonymous sources, but background sources to make sure that people can see the individuals, that they know they're real, that they're there reading stuff. But I think for a lot of folks in government, they're there to serve the American people, to work really hard to work on a particular issue, and they don't necessarily want to have their name and their family particularly exposed to some of the.
But I've heard the complaint coming generically from the White House, from people in the White House complaining about the overuse of anonymous sources by the media. And then I see members of the media sort of rolling their eyes, thinking that some of the people who are saying this are the very people who are making statements and wanting to be anonymous.
Well, again, I think there's a big difference. We get hit with a lot of this. There's 18 people that said the following, and we won't tell you who any of them are. So we have no idea if they're. And again, what I think a lot of times happen is somebody will say, well, I know someone who knows someone who lives next to 2 people whose brother Jimmy is friends with them on Facebook. That's not really a source. And when you're basically defending, that's not somebody in the room. Sometimes we'll have an event, in the Oval Office or in a particular room, and there'll be 4 or 5 people there, and I'll get a call from a reporter. We have 6 sources who said, and I'm like, well, there weren't 6 people there. And so it's very hard to imagine, like, well, we talk to people who talk to people. And it's like, we've all seen the game of telephone. If you just do it among children, you'll get clearly the reason that we actually, teach them sometimes the game is to show how a message will vary by the time it gets 2 or 3 people deep. And I think the question is, how reliable is that source? And when you can get 4 or 5 people that say, we were in the room, that didn't happen, and they go, yeah, I know you have 4 people who are actually there willing to go on the record, but we're not going to accept because we have 2 people who knew 2 people that follow them on Twitter, that you have to weigh that difference of who the sources are. And I don't think that that's getting as much of a play as it should.
Isn't that sort of a two-way street, though? Because even the president will tweet things, and he will tweet things like, for instance, that he's being surveilled, or he was surveilled by President Obama. And it's like, we don't get the sources on that. And yet, the rather dramatic assertions.
Well, again, I think that there's a question, though, about how this happens. We have asked for an investigation in that front through appropriate channels that were classified. I mean, a lot of that material is at a classified level. And so
after the bomb was dropped.
Huh?
Essentially after the tweet. I mean, the tweet came first from the president.
I understand that, but what I'm saying is that there's also how a classified information gets handled is a whole separate discussion. Because again, I think that we've seen, and you've seen both very bipartisan outrage on this, there is a level to which classified information is being shared with journalists and others who are not cleared, and that presents a danger to our country. And I think while journalists sometimes want to toil in this and people want to read the sensational story, there's a reason it's classified. It's because it threatens the safety of the United States and that there are sources and methods that are being protected. I think that we shouldn't be applauding the leaks of classified information. I think the president is right to call this out as a major concern. And I think that you've seen people on both sides of the aisle who've been involved in this world to call that out, that it is concerning when we have classified information and sources that are being used to perpetuate a narrative. And again, if you think about it, it ties your hands when you go to respond, because you can't, just because you claim that you know something classified and you call up, you can't then, we can't then fight back on it because it is classified. So us engaging in that conversation puts us in a very difficult spot.
Well, and I'm not to belabor a point, but this is a city where virtually a lot of things get classified that probably don't need to get classified.
I don't know
mean, for decades there's been an overclassification in the city, which protects.
But that's a whole separate. To your point,
but not an insignificant one. I mean, if they, and
I think on matters of national security, when you are talking about sources and methods and the use of certain things for inappropriate purposes, that is not an overclassification.
The president tweeting. I mean, he says he's going to continue to tweet, and I imagine it complicates your job somewhat.
Well, I think that's the default narrative, but I also think that when you realize that he has an ability through all the channels that he has, well over 100 million people that he can reach out to. And I think some of the media's frustration is that he does have this direct line to the American people where he can communicate accomplishments, thoughts, and push back to false narratives and false stories that frustrates people who want to control that narrative.
I think another way to look at those, he drops some stink bomb essentially, and then in 140 characters or less, and then leaves, and there's no sort of follow-up, so there's no sort of give and take. So
well, again, but I think that for a lot of people, especially outside of Washington, they have yearned for an authentic voice that is not trying to script everything perfectly, as a lot of politicians have done. And the president, even if you disagree with him on policy, I think one of the things that people, give him high marks for is keeping his word and being authentic. And I think that is something that has been missing a lot of times in Washington.
But again, not to belabor, but if you don't have the give and take, if you can't do a follow-up, that's the problem.
But we do. I mean, but again, I would argue that if you look at our engagement, the president, in terms of myself and him and other members of the staff, we are engaging with the media and with outside groups and coalitions and individuals and unions and members of Congress on an extremely robust way, so that there is follow-up, there is a discussion. It is not sort of in a vacuum that's occurring.
Last night he gave an interview, and it was that I read this morning, in which he said that the U.S. is not going to go into Syria. Did you see that?
I did.
Okay. One of the things he has also said is that he's not going to telegraph his plans. He has now just telegraphed to Assad and ISIS that he's not going to go in. How do you reconcile that?
Well, I think that's specific to ground troops. I think there's two issues. One is that doesn't mean, how we're going to deal with ISIS as a whole. So if we have to deal with ISIS and it moves into Syria, that's one thing. I think going in and occupying Syria for the express purpose of regime change is something that the president's been very clear on that throughout the campaign. So I think to sort of try to extrapolate that, I mean, this is something that he talked about well into the campaign, that the use of force and the use of military troops and something like that. So that shouldn't be a shocker. That's been something that he's been talking about for a while.
So Assad should not take it, his comment, that we're not going to go into Syria, to mean that he's not going to do another airstrike necessarily.
Oh, absolutely not.
So that's still on the, that's still up.
Oh, 100%. And I think the president said that in the same interview, that should they continue to use gas, especially against children and babies, that, the president, all options remain on the table. But make no mistake about it, I think the president showed last Thursday night that he will use decisive, justified, and proportional action to right wrongs.
Secretary of State Tillerson is in Russia today in Moscow. And do you know if he's going to meet with Putin? Has that been confirmed or not confirmed?
It has not been confirmed.
Okay. Do you know if he's going to meet with Putin?
It has not been confirmed.
Okay. I'll leave it at that then. I won't give you another follow-up. Assuming he were to meet with Putin, hypothetically, if he were to meet with Putin, what would be his mission? What would be the mission? What's the message to Putin?
Probably. I mean, I think that there's going to be two folds at the front of the agenda. Whether or not he's going to meet with Foreign Minister Lavrov, and he will communicate the same message, which is, number one, I think there is a shared interest in defeating ISIS in the region, that we have a national security concern that should align with their national security. And then with respect to Syria in particular, we've all been party to an international agreement on the use and possession of nuclear weapons, of chemical weapons, and that Russia should live up to its obligations. Remember, Russia right now is an island. It's Russia, North Korea, Syria, and Iran. That is not exactly a group of folks that you want to be associated with. Russia is, among that group, the only non-failed state. So if you're Russia, you are really isolating yourself by aligning yourself with Assad and not calling out the actions that both you and he specifically said that you would not engage in.
So, but what are the consequences? I mean, suppose that Putin...
I think we had a consequence Thursday.
Some consequence, but suppose today that Putin, should this meeting occur, hypothetically, suppose Putin says, okay, I get it, no chemical weapons, but I'm going to help Assad with his barrel bombs and everything else there, because I like my base in Syria, and I'm going to do everything to prop this guy up. Meanwhile, Assad just continues to annihilate civilians and push refugees out of the country.
I think, first and foremost, we have a shared interest in not only defeating ISIS, but stability in the region. I think that is something that we can talk about. Russia is in Syria. I think we can all agree that defeating ISIS should be, and stability there is important. And then I think with respect to regime change, we can't possibly see a stable and peaceful Syria in the future with Assad in charge. So we can have that discussion with them. I'm not going to, I will let the Secretary of State have that discussion with his counterpart at this point. But I think we have projected our interests and concerns to Russia very clearly.
All right, the USS Carl Vinson is steaming its way towards the coast of DPRK of North Korea. Kim Jong-un has had his provocative words, which he has done before, but they've had 5 nuclear tests and they've had multiple missile tests recently. What's the end game on this? Are we just waiting for Saturday to see if Kim Jong-un does something, has another missile launch on the birth date of Kim Il-sung, his grandfather, or what's the program?
I think we need to get the world community in agreement, particularly China. I mean, we've had very productive talks with both Japan and South Korea, but China can play a very important role, and it's something the president discussed with President Xi last week, Thursday and Friday, about again, this is almost like Russia with ISIS, but we have a shared interest with China of making sure that we don't have a nuclear North Korea.
We do have a nuclear North Korea. We do. I mean, they have a nuclear weapon. They have 20,000 artillery weapons on the border facing its soul.
They have short, medium-term missiles. Again, I'm not going to get into discussions about their nuclear capability. I would just say that it is in our shared interest to not have them have the nuclear capability to fly and launch rockets with nuclear capability. And I think that the president had very productive talks with President Xi last week. And I think we need to continue to make sure that the world community stands strong with us, which they have, to make sure that we all understand the threat that North Korea poses.
I don't pretend to have the answer to North Korea at all, but that's the same thing that we heard from President Obama before President Trump, President George Bush, 43 before that, President Clinton before him. Nobody's been able to in any way deter North Korea, and it keeps inching forward.
Yeah, well, I would...
What's different now?
I would just say that I'm not... One is I would go back to last Thursday night. We also had, 6+ years of the last administration drawing red lines and saying that they weren't going to do anything. This president took very decisive action. The world community, bipartisan domestic group here applauded the president's action. I think with North Korea, as I mentioned, the president's had very productive talks with President Xi. We'll see where those talks land.
What could China do? What do you foresee China doing?
This is not a discussion that is one that you have in an open setting. I believe that the president and a lot of the cabinet had very productive talks with China. There's a lot of stuff that can happen diplomatically to continue to isolate North Korea and to undermine their ability to possess and launch nuclear capabilities that threaten us.
Well, we have historically had very little intelligence about what's going on in this hermetically sealed nation.
And I'm not going to.
But let me just go a little bit further. That if China's the purse for North Korea, if China were to cut off money to it, I think, and I don't know, it's just a guess, but I think is that the Kim Jong-un has had no problem just starving his people.
Well, I think that China plays a both economic and political role of influence in North Korea, but we'll see. You know, again, I think this president has clearly shown both the country and the world that there's going to be a change in how the U.S. interests are pursued, and we'll have to see how that shakes out.
All right, tax reform. Are we going to get it this year?
I feel I know that the president and a lot of members of Congress want to do this on two fronts.
Why aren't they doing this now? I mean, it's like, why can't they multitask?
Well, they are multitasking.
Congress on this?
No. But respectfully, I don't think that's true. I mean, we've actually talked about this for the last couple of weeks. The meetings that we've had internally and externally, we've met with the Ways and Means and Finance Committee and leadership. You know, it's interesting how a couple of weeks ago it was we're rushing too quick on something, and then we talk about the other day on multiple occasions how we're laying out a very systematic plan to engage folks. I mean, tax reform hasn't happened since 1986.
I'm not saying that's easy either.
No,
Believe me, I'm just asking where are we on it?
But I think that we've been talking about this, and so I've literally probably been asked about this multiple times in the briefing and laid out where we are in the process. We've had internal discussions. We're starting to engage with stakeholders. They've started to engage with members of Congress, but we've gone 30 plus years without comprehensive tax reform. There's a lot of people who have a lot of ideas on two fronts. One is on the corporate side, we have a big problem with our corporate tax rate maintaining and growing businesses here in the country. They are fleeing our country. And I think this president is committed through both tax reform and regulatory reform to create a better business climate that allows companies to stay here, to want to start here, and to grow here. And you're seeing the progress on a lot, especially on the regulatory front. The president's made tremendous progress.
He can do those by executive order, though.
Yeah, and he has.
But the comprehensive tax reform has got to get this thing up Capitol Hill to move.
Absolutely. But I think on the regulatory reform, and I think that gets overlooked a lot, one of the things, whether it's the automotive sector, the steel sector, the coal and mining sector, and a lot of other manufacturing sectors, that we're seeing a lot of progress. Companies coming back to the United States talking about investments they're going to make, because I think the president's accomplishments and actions on regulatory reform is creating a better business climate for them to be here. But there's the other piece of this, which is the tax piece. It's going to take some months to get this done.
And believe me, I actually am more critical of Congress on this. The president just said we're going to have it, and he's the leader, but Congress is the one who's the engine for this. Congress has got to do this.
And we're engaging with them.
So we'll be by the end of the year.
That is clearly our goal, and I think we've got to look at both the corporate side and then making sure that we really give some relief to middle-class Americans.
In light of the fact that by the end of the year, and if there is comprehensive tax reform, there's going to be a huge revenue shift one way or another. And do you expect that it'll be effective as of the year 2017, or do you think, are we talking sort of prospectively the tax? Any idea?
That's going to be part of the discussion. So to get ahead of when that reform would go into place, whether it's fiscal year 2017 or fiscal year 18, again, that would be probably part of a lot of the discussion.
President Trump also spoke about Steve Bannon last night and about it appears that there's some sort of feud going on in the White House, or maybe feud's a strong word, but something between Jared Kushner and Steve Bannon, at least by the president's remark. What's going on there?
Well, I think a couple things. Number one, I think a lot of it is overblown, what you see in the media. The president has brought together an unbelievably talented team of successful individuals, whether it's in business, academics, government, and there's a lot of opinions. But that's frankly, it's the same team in a lot of ways that had a very successful campaign. I think sometimes you see some of that spill over into public, and that's unfortunate because there's going to be on policy issues a very spirited debate. But I think that's very healthy for the president that he's not getting a monolithic group of advice that says you only should do this and here's how this is. He gets a lot of opinions and ideas and policy shifts that help guide his ultimate decision making. That's a very healthy thing. And I think that what we bring together is a lot of really talented individuals, whether it's Mick Mulvaney and his service in the Congress and his understanding of the budget process, or Steve's understanding of where the policies that the president campaigned on and how to enact them, or Jared's business acumen. There's a lot of things that are being done to help improve the government, to help enact policies that I think both keep us safer and help grow the economy. But there's obviously, going to be spirited debates. I think that is a healthy way for the president to get guidance and ultimately make decisions.
Does the media get in the way of the White House doing its job? I mean, do you feel is this a distraction?
In what way?
I mean, in terms of we report about the feuds. I mean, we're all we ask questions about those things. But in many ways they're important because these are important people in the White House. We've got the president's two top aides seemingly having disagreements, and we don't know the extent of it, and whether it's just an ordinary course of business, two people with two different ideologies, or if it's something more.
Well, I think from a process standpoint, whether or not someone's getting along or not getting along, or whether or not one idea is getting floated or another, doesn't make anyone's life safer or better, right? And I think, to your question, I think the more that the focus is on what are we doing, right or wrong, to make the country better, to strengthen it, to make it safer, is where I'd love to see the focus, right? Is that, what are we doing on tax reform? Where is it? How are we getting done? Who's being involved in the process? What are we doing to make our country more competitive and to grow jobs? Because I think whether or not you live in California or Connecticut, your focus right now is, am I doing okay? Am I able to help my family? Am I able to help my kids? Am I saving something for the future? Is my job safe? Is the business that I work for growing? Am I going to be able to get a raise? Am I able to contribute to my 401k? Are my streets safe? Is my country safe? Those are, I think, the issues that most Americans worry about and plague, that concern them. What am I doing about healthcare premiums? How am I going to keep up? Can I actually go see a doctor anymore? My guess is that that's whether or not you live on the East Coast or the West Coast, North or South, those are the issues that most Americans, I think, are waking up, not whether or not two individuals or three individuals are, going back and forth in the White House. So I understand that there's always going to be a little palace intrigue, but I think that the proportion that I've seen of palace intrigue versus policy is a little out of whack.
All right, what's your wish list? If you had your wish list about the media, I'll give you a chance. What do you want? What do you want? What do you want to change? Well, how can
we only have
be
a minute and 50 seconds left? I will look. It doesn't really matter. In all honesty, the media's got a job to do. We've got a very robust media in this country, both right-leaning, conservative, left-leaning, and so I think as long as we have a healthy and robust media, I'm fine. I wish more people would focus on the policy and get it right. But it is what it is. This is the beauty of living in a free country. And so while I may want a lot of things, I think what we all should want is a media that takes their time, gets the stories right, doesn't worry about being first, but rather being right.
All right. How much do you like the job? 1 to 10?
I love it. I know that people, the funny thing is, that is probably one of the things that people say all the time, like, oh, I truly do believe it's an honor to have this job. It is a privilege. And if you don't believe it so, then you shouldn't be here.
All right, let me ask you about the White House Correspondents' Next. We only have 52 seconds left. Nobody's going. The president's not going, and the members of the White House aren't going. Your thoughts? Your thoughts?
Look, I think that it's, we're just, this is not the appropriate year to go.
Why?
Because I think there's, let's go back to a question before that. I think the relationship and the coverage that we've gotten, I don't think that we should fake it. Going to a dinner where they sit around and you pretend that everything's all hunky-dory is probably not an appropriate year to be doing this. I think that they should go have their dinner, and I know that I know they put a lot of time into it, and that's great. But I don't think that just sitting there and watching a bunch of celebrities walk by is somehow an indication of how much you care about or respect the press or the First Amendment. I think they should have their dinner, but I think we have a right, in the same First Amendment gives us a right to say this isn't appropriate to go, and it sends the wrong signal. And if things get better, maybe we'll attend next year, but this is not the year to do it.
So next year you'll go as my guest. And the time is up. Nice to see you, Sean. Thank you very much. Sean Spicer.
White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer with a pretty revealing discussion at the museum. It spanned over half an hour, covered a wide range of subjects. I do think the headline is Sean's continued response to his own comments that he made yesterday at the White House briefing, where he talked about Adolf Hitler and suggested he didn't use chemical weapons against his own people. Sean once again apologized. He said this was mine to own, mine to apologize for, mine to ask forgiveness for, and he also said, I've let the president down.
That was a major headline, that he let the president down. Also talked somewhat about what the president has said on Syria. And I thought it was interesting, John, at the end, he said, you know, when she asked him what do you want out of the media, he said, I want a media that takes its time and gets things right. A little bit of irony in that, considering sometimes the president's tweets that he is the one who has to defend when they don't have any evidence.
Indeed. And Sean Spicer himself said something yesterday at the lectern that was wrong and offensive. Joining us now, David Gergen, CNN senior political analyst, former presidential advisor. Margaret Hoover, CNN political commentator, Republican consultant. Chris Cillizza, CNN politics editor-at-large reporter, making his 9 a.m. debut. And CNN senior media correspondent, host of Reliable Sources, Brian Stelter. David Gergen, you know, let me start with you. You know, Sean Spicer said things yesterday that were false and offensive, yet he's done something which all politicians, all humans can learn from, which is to apologize fully and completely.
Yeah, good for him. He manned up. He offered an abject and contrite apology, which I thought was sincere. And it's so rare from this White House. Can you remember anybody else in this White House who's actually apologized the way he has? But at the same time, as Chris pointed out, and you know, it's out on the blogosphere now, he really blew it yesterday. There's no question that he's been damaged by this. It's part of a series of things. I do think in his defense, this is a particularly hard job because every day something comes from somebody in the administration, often in tweets, that are extremely hard for him to defend, and he has to go out and be a propagandist to get around it. I mean, just think he's got, you know, Donald Trump doubling down on Susan Rice today in the face of evidence going totally the other way. He's got Secretary Tillerson in this jaw-dropping comment that why should American taxpayers care about Ukraine? And the president himself, just after Sean Spicer earlier this week, you know, equated barrel bombs and chemical weapons and said in either case we might intervene, and he had to walk back from that. In that interview you showed earlier today, here's the president bringing up barrel bombs again, right in the context of chemical weapons, as if the two are equated, and clearly American policy just the opposite. So Sean Spicer has to earn his keep every day, and often he gets banged around for it.
Hey, Brian Stelter, according to Jeff Zelony's reporting from a person very close to Spicer, even though he has had this, you know, full apology, you know, no buts included, right? He said, I've let the president down. A person close to Spicer said, quote, he will have to wait and see if the president thought it was effective. That's interesting.
That's the key quote. I think Zelony's reporting is signaling what everyone in Washington in political circles is asking. I was over at the Newseum a few minutes ago, right before Spicer took the stage. What everybody's talking about there is, has Spicer become too much of a liability? Has he become too much of a liability for this president? And on the other hand, we've been here before. This press secretary has made so many misstatements, so many mistakes, whether they're accidents or intentional, so many errors from the podium that we see him being mocked on late night TV on a regular basis. Obviously, this case is extremely serious, though. It's more significant than most of those past errors, most of those past mistakes. And I think what we saw on stage just now is something I've not seen from Sean Spicer in the past 80 or 90 days. Humility, a contrite tone, a subdued tone, a very respectful tone. That is very different from what we've all seen at the press briefings on a daily basis. So clearly he knows the stakes here. He knows folks at the White House and outside are asking if he's become too much of a liability.
You know, and Chris, just to wrap this up, because there are other subjects to talk about, but humility is one thing, honesty is another, and the White House press secretary still needs to demonstrate a consistent relationship with honesty, as does this White House. I mean, President Trump today saying things that aren't true. He's saying Democrats spent in this congressional election, which isn't true. Democrats predicted victory. That's not true. You know, he's been talking about statements. Again, that is a different thing than humility, Chris.
Well, two things. One, I think there's so much misleading coming out of the White House, and this goes back to the Trump campaign. Muslims were celebrating on New Jersey rooftops after 9/11. Ted Cruz's father was involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. There were 3 to 5 million illegal votes cast. I mean, you only have so much time in a cable news show to go through them, but there are a lot of them. The one thing I will say, though, John, is I wonder if honest in terms of Donald Trump's assessment of whether Sean Spicer is doing a good job. I'm not sure strict adherence to the facts is the #1 measure that Donald Trump is taking. I think he doesn't like when someone who is a subordinate of his makes bad news for him. And this is now 2 days in a row, Monday and Tuesday of this week, that Sean Spicer has done just that.
I do want to get to the Steve Bannon news because you heard Greta ask him about that, and he said, well, it's sort of palace intrigue, and the media is more focused on that, and it's overblown. I mean, when he said overblown, I thought, the Post is quoting the president's own words. So let's read them to you about Steve Bannon in this call that the president gave this phone interview last night. I like Steve, but you have to remember he was not involved in my campaign until very late. By the way, that's not true. He also said, I had already beaten all the senators and governors, and I didn't know Steve. I'm my own strategist, and it wasn't like I was going to change strategies because I was facing crooked Hillary. Now, aside from the important fact that that statement is not completely true, Bannon was involved before near the end of the campaign. Margaret Hoover, to you. What does Bannon do now? I mean, it's pretty clear Kushner wins out in these fights.
Yeah, and there's the President of the United States clearly separating himself from the guy who has an office across from the Chief of Staff, the two people who were placed in the most important offices in the West Wing. And there are many people, on the right especially, who think that Steve Bannon deserves a lot of blame for the failures of the president's first 100 days. Remember, he spent his late career cultivating and fomenting the forces on the far right, which sunk the health care bill, right? They gave the fuel to the Freedom Caucus and fuel to its supporters, which at Breitbart News and others, which ultimately created failure for the president. So he is a liability for the White House on a policy issue, let alone the fact that he has said he's going to create a home for the alt-right.
What's your crystal ball? I mean, is Bannon out in a matter of weeks?
Look, I don't read tea leaves in the Trump White House. I don't know if you do, but this is not a good smoke signal.
When the president doesn't embrace you, when the president stiff arms you so everyone in America can read it, that is a tea leaf that I think we can all read.
Do you want Steve Bannon as an enemy? That's some other interesting reporting this morning. You know, senior aides saying, Zeleny, do you really want Bannon as an enemy?
Or Steve Flynn or anybody else who leaves. Yeah. Look, the point is, does he deserve a West Wing office right next to the Oval Office? Absolutely not.
All right. Thank you guys very much. David Gergen, Margaret Hoover, Brian Stelter, Crystal Liza, nice to have you all.
All right, joining us right now, we're going to shift gears and talk about some of this policy. Former governor of New Mexico, ambassador to the United Nations, Secretary of Energy, a man who's done a great many things. Bill Richardson joins us right now. Governor, I don't know where to begin because there's so much news today, but let's start with Syria if we can, because Sean Spicer just made clear that when the president said we're not going into Syria, he was talking about ground troops. But Sean made clear that very much on the table the possibility of future airstrikes. Does that make sense to you?
No, I think what we're seeing is a topsy-turvy, unpredictable foreign policy that changes by the day. And what needs to happen is coherence in the foreign policy team and in the policy. This is what I think the president needs to elucidate his end game in Syria, his objectives. And I think another thing that came out of this press conference is the Secretary of State, I think, is starting to build his stature, but he doesn't talk to the press. He should be making these foreign policy statements on North Korea, on Syria, on airstrikes, on red lines, along with the president, not the press secretary. I mean, this man, Sean Spicer, he's got a very difficult job. I acknowledge that. But he's making policy by talking about tax reform, talking about Syria, talking about North Korea. He shouldn't be doing that. The president's economic spokesman, Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, you know, there's a vacuum. And I think the president needs to find a way to get a coherent message from his domestic and foreign policy team.
You know, it's interesting, Governor Richardson, and you have a particularly unique view of North Korea, considering you've traveled there at least 8 times, worked very closely on getting some Americans released from North Korea. You're working on one current case right now. Tillerson came out recently about North Korea and just said, we're not saying anything. But then the president in this interview with Maria Bartiromo talked about sending an armada into North Korea, et cetera. This as North Korea is messaging that they are ready for war. What do you make of all of that? And is something more dangerous about Kim Jong-un now than before?
Well, the danger is in his unpredictability. The danger is that there's a tinderbox in Asia with China making geopolitical moves, South Korea having an election coming up, and then the stakes for us is we have 28,000 American troops in South Korea, 50 in Japan, and North Korea about to launch either another missile or a nuclear test. So we need to develop a new policy towards North Korea. It seems that the latest Trump initiative is to let China do the dirty work, lean on North Korea. I think that's sensible, but I think it makes sense to spell out the region's objectives, the U.S. objectives on Syria and North Korea. I do think the Trump foreign policy is starting to move in the right direction.